Welcome back to the Politics with Paul podcast, your home for nonpartisan discussion of political science and civics. I am your host, Paul Rader. Today we're going to talk about the trustworthiness and sincerity of responses in public opinion polling, because political polling faces many challenges today, and a large part of that is both the negative and positive misconceptions about it and how it works. And that goes for both the general public and those who are more involved in politics for a living. For some people, they think that polls are inherently lying or unreliable whenever election results don't exactly reflect polls, or the polls say something that they personally don't want to hear. But you also have some people that read too much into polls, and they take things at face value, or they don't critically evaluate why poll results are the way they are, or what people might really think, or what they might be willing to actually do. And so today is going to be more about that latter group, the ones that have those positive misconceptions about polling, or more accurately, positive misconceptions about certain polling results that they may like or be supportive of themselves. Whenever you take polling too much at face value, or you extrapolate the results too far to say things that they're not actually saying, you can run into some pitfalls in campaign strategy and logic, or just simply earnest discussion about public policy. And so this episode is going to be about how trustworthy and sincere the respondents in polls are, and how that can affect how we interpret the results of these polls. Are these respondents in polls telling the truth about their feelings? Do they sometimes lie to or mislead pollsters, or even themselves? Do respondents recognize their biases and the impacts of said biases on their own answers? Is there a correlation between public opinion and public action? And what are the implications of these answers for how we interpret public opinion? Well, first, let's talk about what makes a trustworthy and sincere respondent in a poll. Vast majority of people that answer poll questions are not purposely trying to lie or mislead the pollster and ruin a poll. They're not sitting there thinking, oh, this is a poll, let me ruin this person's day who gets paid to make these polls, or not to necessarily make these polls, but to administer these polls. They're not doing that necessarily. Probably a couple of people that are like that, but it's really not a common thing. They're not trying to screw over a poll. And this isn't necessarily a value judgment on the respondents either, to say, oh, but are they really being sincere and truthful? But their opinions can be influenced in various ways by either their existing biases and prejudices, or the potential biases of the poll itself. And so I don't want to get caught up too much in actual value judgments on these respondents. It's not necessarily about, whether these people are whether they are natural liars or anything like that. But respondents can sometimes be not only necessarily not forthright about what they really think, but they can be inconsistent and give contradictory answers within the same poll. It doesn't necessarily mean they're lying, though. It may just be about how some questions are worded. As we'll see shortly, the wording of questions has a heavy impact on the results of polls. But sometimes respondents just don't see the contradictions as contradictions or inconsistencies. One poll I think of is, within the past couple years, Georgetown University did one that it covered a whole bunch of different things. But one of the findings that it had was that most of the people in the poll wanted compromise. But in that same poll, they also felt that they had compromised enough and that the other side needed to compromise a little bit more. And then even further in the poll, some of those same people said, well, okay, I can maybe compromise a little bit more if I need to. 3 seemingly inconsistent, contradictory answers there, but it goes to show how ambivalent people can be, how they can have what seem to be differing opinions about a public policy or a political issue or whatever it is, but they can still actually hold them at the same time and not see any contradiction. And maybe it's not a contradiction. Maybe that's just, maybe somebody else thinks it's a contradiction, but they don't. It's not necessarily objective that it's inconsistent either. And there's also the fact that a lot of people say that they're open to voting for independents and third-party candidates, and that they want a third major party to contend with Republicans and Democrats. But voters rarely ever act on that. They rarely ever vote for an independent. A lot of times they think that it's simply a waste of a vote, so they vote for, quote-unquote, the lesser of two evils. Even if there is a strong independent candidate there, and by strong, I mean not necessarily that I think that they have good views, but that they run a solid campaign, that they're well funded, that they're able to compete with the two major parties, or even against one major party. And so a lot of people can say that they really want an independent, but they don't often act upon it either. So it's one of those contradictions you sometimes see in polling. Regardless of whether they see things as contradictions or not, even if putting aside what can be potentially contradictory answers, there's just a lot of biases and incentives for respondents to answer certain ways when they're being questioned in a poll. And so polls must be crafted carefully to have as little bias in the results as possible. But even the most expertly designed ones aren't always foolproof, and they have to account for those things when they analyze polls. And that can get very grimy and in the muck and can be very boring for a lot of people to hear about, but it's important work to do. And so 5 of the biggest biases and incentives that can directly impact how a member of the public answers a poll, and thus impacts the level of trustworthiness and sincerity of the responses in said poll. Social desirability bias, the impact of the wording of questions, the aspects of the pollster themselves, acquiescence bias, and party and ideological biases of the person answering the questions. So some of it is those pre-existing biases of the people answering the polls, and some of it has to do with the pollster or the poll itself. So social desirability bias is just a general way to refer to when we say the things that we think are going to be more acceptable to whoever it is that is polling us. Nobody wants to be stigmatized or ostracized, or at least they don't want to be ostracized by everybody. We all want to find our people, so to speak, that we fit in with. And maybe we'll say screw what anybody else thinks, but we all want to fit in somewhere. So what is socially desirable can appear to be different things to different people, because what is socially desirable isn't necessarily totally objective or accepted by every segment in society. So maybe it's not society at large we're trying to be socially desirable to, but maybe it's to a specific segment that we subscribe to. In any case, several common examples of social desirability that you see is the self-reporting of voting behavior being much higher than actual voter turnout. You might see something like actual voter turnout in an area being like 50-55%, but if you polled the people in that place, in that area, you would see 70-75% of them say that, oh yeah, I voted, which is obviously some of them are lying, but it's a matter of, even though we do have a lot of problems with voter turnout in this country, especially when you get to non-presidential elections, you see a lot of people do realize that there is sort of a social moray, a norm that you are supposed to go and vote, even though a lot of people don't do it. And they don't want to seem like somebody who doesn't exercise that basic right to vote, because they think that they're going to get ridiculed for it. So they just say, oh yeah, I voted, and I voted for so-and-so, even if that may not actually be true. Or they would have voted for that person if they actually went out to vote, but they didn't go out to vote, so they didn't vote for that person. Shying away from something that that respondent might be afraid will make them seem bigoted. Whether it truly would be a bigoted thing to say or not is beside the point. If they think that somebody's going to accuse them of racism, sexism, homophobia, anything like that, they might respond in a way that they think won't get them that response. Now, you might have some people that respond that way because they want to poke the bear, so to speak. They want to do something that they think will get a rise out of people. But in polling, you don't necessarily see that a whole lot. Another example of social desirability bias is people saying what they expect their social group that they ascribe to would say. Maybe you have a segment of the population that is much more opposed to voting for Donald Trump, and maybe that individual is like, oh, you know what, I actually do support Donald Trump, but they don't want to say that because they think they're going to get ostracized. Or if we go back to the 2024 election, somebody who you would expect to vote for Donald Trump, but maybe they actually wanted to vote for Kamala Harris, and maybe they actually did vote for Kamala Harris, but they thought that would look bad for them because of the groups that they tend to ascribe to. That's another way that they might have been impacted by social desirability bias. The calling for more compromise in politics. Usually, people don't want to be considered extremists, or they think other people are extremists, but never themselves. And so they might say that they actually want more compromise in politics when really they don't. They actually just want people to acquiesce to what they want. And there was also the possibility of social desirability bias back in 2016 when Donald Trump won, despite the fact that polls indicated that he had little shot to do it, and it seemed like Hillary Clinton was going to win. Donald Trump actually did, and some people speculated that was because a lot of voters didn't want to admit that they were voting for Donald Trump because they feared that they would be ostracized if they did that. And so one way you can limit social desirability bias is to assure these respondents that their answers are confidential and anonymous. They're not going to be shared with anybody, and a pollster will do that if they are a reputable pollster. But even with these assurances, people won't necessarily believe that they're going to be anonymous, or they might think that the pollster will do whatever they can to keep those answers anonymous, but they fear that somehow those answers will be traced back to them. And so they still want to sound like a good person to the pollster, or at least what that person thinks would sound like a good person to that pollster. And so you see this social desirability bias pop up fairly frequently in polls, and obviously you try to minimize that as much as possible, and some of it is also with the wording of questions, which is our next key area to focus on when it comes to how people can be biased and incentivized to answer in certain ways on polls that they might not have answered without the bias and incentive. So with the wording of questions, even minor tweaks can skew how people respond. And it might be conscious. They might realize what's going on and still tweak the responses, or it might not even occur to them that this certain wording in a question will change the response. And if pollsters are not careful, they can intentionally or unintentionally lead respondents in the survey to answer a certain way and bias your results and not get an accurate reading on what the public opinion is about an issue or a candidate or whatever the case may be. And some of this might be words that inherently add value judgments to a question. And so you want to use these as little as possible. Some of these value judgments might be obvious, others might not. Examples of this impact of wording, you can see it in things like a very common example of that would be using the term welfare versus government aid programs. When you ask people if they support welfare, they tend not to because they see that as, well, as government handouts. It's the government babying people when people should be able to fend for themselves. But if you say government aid programs, you start to think of it as, oh, okay, well, these people are down on their luck and we're just trying to give them a helping hand. We need to help them out here. Another way that you see it is when you talk about war versus special military operation versus conflict, or some other semantic variation of those phrases. When Russia first invaded Ukraine, it was not a war, it was a special military operation. Obviously, that's a bunch of BS. It is a war, but that's one example of that kind of thing in polls, is when you describe a war as something a little bit more palatable, like a special military operation or a conflict. Or if you take a conflict and call it a war when maybe not a lot of other people call it a war. Another thing that can lead to biases and incentives for people to change their answers in a poll is aspects of the pollster themselves. And the pollster isn't necessarily trying to manipulate answers. A lot, if they're reputable, they're not trying to manipulate answers, but they have to be very, very careful. Even the experts can trip up here. Things like who the individual pollster is, the polling firm they represent, how they ask questions, how they sound, all these things can influence people's responses in sometimes even the most subtle ways. For example, a friendlier pollster, or a pollster that at least sounds like they're friendlier, can make the respondent more relaxed and willing to open up about their true feelings. But if the pollster sounds more gruff, maybe the other person is like, oh, you know what, I'm going to try to say things that sound more agreeable to this person who's asking me these questions. And so the perceptions of who the pollster is can change responses, and that might be through reasonable information, and some of it might just be based on preconceived biases. So if you hear a pollster that sounds like a female, and you're a male respondent, you might respond in a way that you think a female would be more supportive of, or a female respondent might be more comfortable with that female pollster. It can be the same thing the other way around. If it sounds like a male pollster, a female respondent might respond more in a way that a male, or what they think a male would be more supportive of, or a male respondent may feel like they can be more forthright with a male pollster. If the pollster sounds like the stereotype of a gay or lesbian person, the respondents, even if they're not necessarily all that supportive of issues that are LGBTQ, they may respond more positively about LGBTQ issues and be more supportive of stances like gay marriage or transgender participation in women's sports. And so some pollsters also try not to say what polling firm they represent in case it biases results, because the respondents may look up that firm and either change their coming answers for various reasons, or they might disconnect from the survey because they're like, oh, you work for those kinds of people? Screw you. I'm not going to answer for a Republican firm or a Democratic firm. Or you might say, oh, then they probably think the way I do. I'm going to be more eager to answer this survey. Another potential bias or incentive is acquiescence bias. And this is the tendency to agree with survey questions or statements regardless of what that respondent really feels. Some people are predisposed to say yes for various reasons, like the fact that agreeing is mentally much easier to do than disagreeing, and disagreeing is more likely to lead to a follow-up question of why. Some pollsters have that where they say, if this respondent disagrees with this sentiment, ask them why. And then so they have to think longer about why they disagree with something. If you just say you agree and you just don't want to cause any issues, you're just naturally a more agreeable person. Like if you do personality tests, some personality tests test agreeableness as a personality trait. Some more agreeable people will simply agree with questions no matter what it is, even if they don't actually agree with the question or statement. They might think that it's just simply more pleasing to the pollster. It's similar to social desirability bias, where they say, oh, well, you know what? This pollster probably wants me to say that I agree, so I'm going to say I agree. Or based on their perceptions of who the pollster is, they might respond more agreeably with, or based on whatever the question is. Or there might have been cultural norms that taught those respondents to value what is viewed as politeness and respect for authority and avoidance of confrontation. And politeness has some, I guess you could say there's just a certain level of debate about what's actually polite in politics. And some people think that they just don't want to get into any sort of arguments with people, and they think that it's impolite to actually have any sort of disagreements, which is not true. But some people feel that that's the case, and they've been taught that way. And so they think it's, you know what, I think this is what the pollster wants me to say, so I'm just going to say it. And then lastly, the party and ideological biases of these respondents that can skew their answers. This is probably a more obvious one, but it can crop up in ways that you don't necessarily expect. So our party and ideological affiliations predispose us to think certain ways based on who is in office or whoever is in question. And if we already know who that person is, like, oh, tell us your opinion about candidate A, and they're a Republican and you're a Republican, you're probably going to be more predisposed to say, oh yeah, I like them, even if you don't actually know who they are. Same thing with if it's a Democrat or Democratic voter being asked about a Democratic candidate. So there's some expectation that Republicans will think a certain way or tend to think a certain way, and that Democrats will tend to think a certain way. But even things that don't seem to have a partisan or ideological leaning may lead to a stark divide. And one very notable, common instance of that is when there are questions about, what do you think of the direction of the country? Well, if you're a voter who is in the party that's in power, you're going to think that the direction of the country is great, usually. You're going to say we're in a golden age and that your finances are doing great, or that they could be better, but they're going to be fixed by whoever's in charge. And then if you're in the party that's out of power, you think that everything sucks and that we're heading for an even worse time. And to some extent, there is that aspect of declinism where people just naturally have a predisposition to say that, oh, things suck and they're getting worse each day, regardless of whether your party's in power. But there is a noticeable divide where as soon as party power changes, where Republicans shift to Democrats or Democrats shift to Republicans, suddenly there is a noticeable flip between Republicans and Democrats in respondents, where now Democrats say the opposite thing that they were saying before, and Republicans say the exact opposite thing that they were saying before, all because of who is in office. Not necessarily because they've really thought about whether or not things are going well for them, but because they have those partisan biases. And so there's a bunch of different ways that respondents in polls can be influenced to say or think a certain way, even if it's not ultimately what they really think. But that's not the only part of the issue. The other part of the issue is when we see pundits and observers and campaigners and politicians look at these public opinion polls and start to read too much into what these opinions are saying. Regardless of how sincere respondents in polls are, let's just say for a moment that their opinions are 100% sincere. Pundits and campaigners and so on make a common mistake that is quite an easy trap to fall into, and it can happen to pretty much all of us. I've certainly been guilty of this too. We fail to recognize that there is often a disconnect between public opinion and public willingness to take action on said opinions. Because it's great to want politics to be fixed. Who doesn't want politics to be fixed? It's all well and good to want to be open to all these big reforms, like reforming the primary system and wanting proportional representation and all these things. That's the first step to making reforms and to making changes in politics. You need the public support behind it. But we often get caught up in these polls where we say, oh, look what the people want. Change is right around the corner. This thing that I support, look at how many other people support it too. Or it creates easy fodder for political talk shows to say, oh, well, will this thing happen? So they can get clicks and views about the thing that is the salient topic that is right now the topic of the day. And all sorts of proposals get this kind of coverage. You see it for voting for an independent for president. How many people say they want an independent to be president? People wanting a third major party to contend with Republicans and Democrats. Term limits. Campaign finance reform. Independent redistricting commissions across the board. Initiatives to depolarize politics, wanting better dialogue and a spirit of compromise, proportional representation. The list is endless. But sentiment does not inherently translate into action. In fact, it often doesn't translate into action at all. Public opinion is a great luxury to have, but it only has so much power. If public opinion were as powerful as we act like it is, politics wouldn't suck so much. There would be far fewer scandals, more long-lasting solutions to political woes, more earnest conversations across political divides, more politicians genuinely listening to their constituents instead of their donors and the most polarized voices. So respondents can say that they support all these reforms and so on, and they may be earnest about that, but they have to actually act on those opinions and pressure politicians in order to actually make those changes happen. And right now, there is little incentive for lawmakers to get the ball rolling on these changes like term limits, proportional representation, independent redistricting commissions for all states. And there's little incentive for them to make these changes because we don't actually punish politicians for not acting on this public support. When's the last time you saw somebody lose a campaign because they didn't support term limits? Because they didn't call for an independent redistricting commission in their state, or because they didn't say that we should have a third major party contending for elections regularly like Republicans and Democrats do. Few times, if ever, have you seen that happen. The general public does not participate nearly enough in politics, and this is not an attempt to, rag on people who don't vote all the time. Because some people do have understandable grievances about politics. Some people, though, are just plain lazy and they want to complain, but they don't want to actually do something. Some people want to do something, but they feel like their opinion doesn't matter at all, and so they think, what is even the point? And there's a big difference between those two opinions. Now, obviously, I think more people should be participating in politics. And part of the reason why I made this podcast and I do the work I do is to try to get more people to become more involved in politics in a healthy manner. Fact of the matter is, amongst nations that have free elections, U.S. tends to rank pretty low. And it's not just because some countries have mandatory voting. We just genuinely have low participation typically in politics, and not just in voting. You especially see it in actual participation in campaigns, for example. And so the general public just does not participate nearly enough in politics to push these politicians to actually make a lot of these changes. The most polarized voices do, and those are the ones that politicians typically listen to. And oftentimes, these polarized voices don't want a lot of these proposals for reforms that people have proposed, like proportional representation or expanding the U.S. House so that it has more members. Or they are caught up in all of these other issues that they want. And these are the ones that typically are higher up on the legislative agenda. And the legislative agenda is more focused on a bunch of these other issues that often still fail to get resolved. And these are the ones that get more fanfare and more media coverage and voter involvement. It's a lot easier to get people going about things like abortion and guns and LGBTQ policies and the economy. It's a lot harder to get them really focused on things like term limits and proportional representation, and to have any issues like that or proposals like that for reform supplant all these other highly charged issues that we see, like abortion and guns. And also, incumbents get reelected upwards of 80 and 90% all the time, despite not actually working on a lot of these reforms. So we don't really punish politicians for not acting on all of these things that we want to see or that we say we want to see. Now, does that mean that people aren't really sincere about wanting these things like proportional representation and term limits? No. But it does go to show that they're not necessarily enthusiastic about making those things happen, or that they're not willing to take any steps to make those things happen. And that's not necessarily critical either. Sometimes people just don't know where to begin to try to get involved in any of these campaigns for reform. But people can say that they want all these things like campaign finance reform and competitive elections and term limits and more compromising politicians and so on in these polls. And they a lot of times do say that they want these things. A majority of these polling respondents do want those things frequently. And they may be sincere about that, but they have to actually get involved to try to make these changes happen and threaten politicians with real electoral consequences for not acting on what the public wants. And a lot of these reformers who are involved in trying to make these reforms happen, like proportional representation and term limits and so on, they get ahead of themselves and think, oh, because so much of the public wants this, surely this means that we can make these things happen. Well, not exactly. Public support is one thing. Action is a totally other thing. So, are respondents in polls trustworthy? Are they sincere? Are they really telling us what they feel? For the most part, yes, they are. And they want to be sincere for the most part. But their answers in polls can be manipulated in ways they are consciously aware of and in ways that they don't realize. And it's not a simple question of, well, do people lie about their feelings in polls? It's not necessarily that. And there's a difference between what people want and the desire to do something about it. And something that I'm going to cite at the end of this podcast in my show notes is my 5-day educational email course on polarized politics and a lot of these mistakes that people who are involved in depolarizing politics or want to depolarize politics, they make that mistake too, where they see so many people sick of the fighting and polarization and the two-party dichotomy and all these things, but they don't necessarily want to take action on those things. Maybe they just don't know where to begin. Maybe they just think that their efforts are going to be worthless. Some people just like to complain. But there is that difference, that disconnect between wanting something and wanting to do something about that something. It's where a lot of these campaigns get tripped up, such as those for these independent and third-party candidates for elected office. Regardless of what public opinion says, however, those of us analyzing these responses have to be careful not reading too much into what they say. Having an opinion on reforms is easy. Acting on those opinions is not. And it's not always easy to know how enthusiastic members of the general public are about an issue. They can say that they're enthusiastic about it, but are they really? Something that you sometimes see in polls for candidates' campaigns is they'll ask respondents, how excited are you to vote in an election, or how enthusiastic are you to vote in the upcoming election? And those two words, even though they seem like they're the same thing, can actually gather much different responses. Or you can say, how much are you looking forward to voting in an election? Because somebody might be ready to vote in an election and they're ready for it to come and they're super eager about it, but they aren't necessarily excited about it. Some people, it is just, they feel it's just their duty to vote in elections, and there's no bells and whistles to it. They're not going to be ecstatic about doing it. It's just they think that's what they have to do. Admittedly, I have been that person very frequently. I don't usually get excited about their campaigns. I just want to exercise my right to vote because I think it's very important for me to exercise my right to vote. And you would hope so, considering that I've done this podcast and my career is in politics, but not everybody who's involved in politics is a voter. You'd be very surprised to see that. But in any case, there's a difference between having an opinion about something and wanting to do something about it, and whether you're enthusiastic about seeing that change happen. So don't assume poll respondents are lying, but also think critically about how forthright they are and whether they realize that they are changing their answers about something, or that they're being contradictory or inconsistent, and whether those opinions will actually lead to them taking action. Because if you read too much into these public opinion polls, you might think that they're ready to actually do something when they aren't yet. And it might take time. It might take years and years, and you find out that the people who wanted these things to happen are finally ready to take action. Or younger people who have now become old enough to vote, who are old enough to participate more regularly in politics, are more eager to make these reforms that they support happen. And of course, all that is easier said than done. You still have to actually have the right strategy to make these reforms happen too. And that comes with, in large part, incentivizing elected officials to act on these reforms, like proportional representation, term limits, and so on. So, always take responses in polling with a little grain of salt. Don't assume that it's lying or insincerity, but remember that you still have to fill in that gap between wanting to see something happen and having the desire to make that something happen. And that's going to end it for today's episode of Politics with Paul. As always, thank you so much for listening and watching. Please like, share, and subscribe. Comment. Tell me what you think. And if you're interested in any particular topics, you can message me on LinkedIn or email me. But speaking of those links, my other works, my medium.com profile, which I write on from time to time, my 5-day educational email course that I just cited about how we can more effectively depolarize politics, and some of the common mistakes that are made in regards to trying to depolarize politics, my book on Amazon and several other retailers, but the Amazon links are on there too, about political independence and why they struggle so much in elections and how they could possibly become more competitive. And then my links, my LinkedIn profile, my Facebook page, my website, and my email, paulraderwrites@gmail.com. So thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.